So thank you for joining us. My name is John Murtaugh. I'm a representative here based out of Denver. So a representative with the Defenders of Wildlife. And a lot of my focus, particularly over the past 2 years, has been on Colorado's wolf reintroduction. So going to chat a bit about that today. And I'll just use this to kind of give us a little outline. I'll talk in a moment just very briefly about who Defenders is and kind of what our role was. And then I'll do a little review of the history of wolves in Colorado, why Colorado was so important to do a reintroduction, and then what our next steps are, which really involve a lot of how the State Wildlife Commission is setting up the wolf planning process. So just a quick little bit on Defenders. Defenders is a national organization that's dedicated to imperiled species primarily. Our focus is really trying to focus on those diverse wildlife populations and make sure that our endangered and imperiled species have a chance not just to recover but to thrive. So we do that in a number of ways. That can be activism on the ground. That could be lobbying in DC. That could be field studies that we use to support arguments. A lot of that, in my case, often is just trying to build relationships with different players in the wildlife world. And that could be anything from wildlife agents at the state and federal level, and it can be individuals as well. I mentioned a little bit before we started recording how important it is to do this kind of outreach work with the people who encounter wildlife all the time. And that's often rural communities. And so it's really important to build those relationships. But when it comes to wolves specifically, Defenders has a long history. Obviously, we went ahead and put the wolf on our logo, so that's a really important species to us, and it's something we've been working on for a long time. In the lower left, you'll see this picture is from the 1995 reintroduction, and that's the former president of Defenders, Robert Schleichman. I always get his name wrong. And in the lower right, this is the reintroduction of Mexican gray wolves, and that's the current president, pointing an arrow right there. That's Jamie Rappaport Clark. So we primarily have done a lot of work in the Rockies, though we do have some presence throughout the nation when it comes to wolf recovery. So let's get into our local issue here. Why Colorado? Well, if you take a look at this this map on the right, you can see where wolves in the West are today, and where they that's both where they currently are in terms of habitat range and states occupied. So that kind of darker looking yellowish brownish color, that's their specific range that they occupy. And you'll notice Colorado is the missing link. If we get Colorado colored in there, we have an opportunity to connect those populations from the northern Rockies to the Mexican gray wolf population. The idea of that is to create that north-south corridor that would allow for genetic exchange, allow for travel. It would reestablish a very vital corridor throughout the spine of the continent. Throughout the spine of the continent. In addition, there's ideal wolf habitat throughout Colorado. Colorado has the largest elk herd in the nation. It has ample prey base. We've got about 17 million acres of public lands just on the western slope alone. So there's a lot of potential for wolves to kind of get themselves reestablished back in the state. But we have had some wolves in the state over the past years. This is going back to 2004, and that would be the first confirmed sighting of a wolf. So again, recognizing that there may be unconfirmed sightings, this is what the Parks and Wildlife Agency has confirmed. And in nearly every case, when a wolf enters Colorado, they die in Colorado. That's not to say that it happens immediately, but sooner or later, they fail to find a mate, they fail to start a family, and eventually, like all animals, they slip away. So this has been a major point of concern because people have said, well, the wolves will get here eventually. Just let them come on their own. You don't need to do a reintroduction. And the realities of that is if you take a look here at a couple of maps, on the left, we have suitable habitat. And on the right, that's actually a picture of Wyoming, our neighboring square state. And you'll see in this predatory animal management area, that's about 85% of the state. And in that region, there's absolutely no rules on how you hunt and eliminate wolves. They are treated as vermin, they're treated as predators, the same way that coyotes are. And so you don't need a license. There's no means of take, no regulation whatsoever. Meanwhile, referring back to this image on the left, you look at the suitable territory, and I'm not sure if I don't think I can do a laser pointer here. Well, you'll see in the northwest corner of Colorado, that's the Uinta Mountain Range that extends into Utah. That's one popular corridor. And then you can see there's a northern corridor that kind of covers the grand North Park area of Colorado. In between, in that kind of no man's land in southern Wyoming, that's the Red Desert. It is less than ideal habitat for wolves. What all of this kind of comes together to suggest is that it is difficult for wolves to get here on their own. There are only a couple of corridors they can take where there's suitable habitat, and all the while in Wyoming, they can be eliminated, and they are often viewed in sort of an antagonistic way. So they are often persecuted. As a result, very few wolves have made it to Colorado, and those that do, as I mentioned earlier, fail to reproduce, fail to survive. Meanwhile, in the past 25 years since wolves were reintroduced into the Northern Rockies, they've recolonized places like Oregon, Washington, and even California. So that really speaks to their ability to move west, but their inability to move south because of these kind of anthropocentric, barriers. So that's a little background on why we went to the ballot. We recognized it was so important to get wolves here. The state agencies had a few barriers and some inaction and weren't moving the ball forward, but we knew that this was popular among Coloradans, something Coloradans wanted. So we went ahead and took it to the ballot. And sure enough, last November, Colorado's Proposition 114 became State Statute 33-2-105.8. So this means this is now a law. It is in the Colorado State Statute book. So, great.
Do you have any insight into why the polls and the outcome of the election were so divergent?
I have speculation, and what I would say, I would speculate there were a couple of major things that happened since those polls were conducted. One, of course, COVID, and that had a big impact on how people were viewing wildlife. I think especially early in the pandemic, there was all this discussion that this was a zoonotic disease. There were even some wolf opponents in Colorado trying to draw a direct link between coronavirus and wolves, which is of course absurd. But that had a big impact, and because that stressed the state budget. There were concerns about can Colorado afford this now, and that I think became a very salient argument. Even though the proposition did not require any tax funding, opponents still argued that it did and still presented it that way, which I think swayed some people. The other aspect of this is in January of last year, a PAC was confirmed in Moffat County. And I think that worked on people a lot to make them think, oh, well, there's a PAC here. So they're already here. We don't need to spend the money. We don't need to, do this kind of burdensome process. I will say we have not heard any updates on that PAC in months and months and months and months. I don't know what's happened to them, but I'm led to believe that they are no longer an intact PAC. There may be a few individuals there, but that's exactly the point of why we felt a reintroduction was necessary. Is because the persecution and the just risk of having a single PAC lead to a population. A PAC is of course a family. So I think that played a lot into it. And finally, there's just one other aspect. When you have a question on a ballot, no change is the easy answer, And so when you're asking people, do you want to make a change? Even though they might like wolves, they might say, change is scary. So again, all speculative. There's been no, scientific analysis on that. Nobody's done a poll or anything, but so just getting a little bit into what comes next, just a quick little overview. This is pulled directly from the language, but what needs to happen next? Well, what this law says is that the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission must convene, hold statewide hearings to acquire information to develop the plan. They have to have public input as a part of this. They must reintroduce wolves by December 31st, 2023. and they have to oversee a livestock compensation program. So assist owners of livestock in preventing and resolving conflicts. And who is the commission? Well, here are our commissioners. So in Colorado, the Parks and Wildlife Commission is an 11-member citizen board. All members are appointed by the governor, just like all commissions in the state. And they have some rules on who gets represented. So for example, there are 2 at-large members, 3 who have to represent outdoor recreation. We have 3 who represent sports persons and 3 who represent agriculture. And so these commissions do often tend to have, I'm not sure if I'd say a bias, but they tend to lean in the direction of agriculture and sports persons' interests. You can see just by its kind of statutory composition that's the way it's built. But that being said, I think these commissioners have done a pretty good job in taking the challenge that we've issued them in November and running with it and setting up some parameters of how this is going to go. So here's a little bit what it looks like. Just here on the right, this is the commission schedule for their meetings. You can see we've had 3 meetings already, January, February, and March. There will not be a meeting scheduled this month unless there's an emergency need. So we're currently looking at the next date of May 5th and 6th. Fortunately, these throughout the pandemic have been virtual. We certainly hope they will continue to be virtual even when they return to in-person meetings, just because that, I think, expands public access in a really positive way. And of course, lots of Coloradans are keyed into this issue and paying attention. They have set up a couple special things. So one, they have their own email address for comments, because of course commissioners are getting flooded with wolf comments. So they're asking everybody to send it to a specific email address. And they also have started an e-newsletter specific to the wolf reintroduction updates. So I recommend anybody who wants to stay on top of this, you can go to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife page. You can go to the wolf management tab that they have, and on there you can sign up to join that e-newsletter. Of course, they have an e-newsletter for lots of issues. It'll ask you what you're interested in. You can just check the box for wolf updates. So the commission has adopted a 3-year proposal that CPW put together. And I'm going to just sort of walk us through a little bit of what that proposal looks like. Largely in year 1, which is what we're currently in, it calls for the creation of a stakeholder advisory group and a technical work group. The idea here is the stakeholder advisory group will be comprised of everyday Coloradans, ideally from some diverse backgrounds across the state. We do know that traditionally the members of stakeholder advisory groups like this might include ranchers, sports persons, NGOs like ourselves, and other interested parties. We have certainly been asking CPW, and I believe the commission's been responsive to saying, let's expand it beyond those traditional partners and let's get lots of other folks in there too. Outdoor recreation is a big one to make sure we get included. But what they've done is they had opened up a application so anybody could apply to join this group. And then the director of CPW, alongside support for staff, will select the final members of that group. They're also putting together a technical work group. The idea of the technical work group is that this will be agency staff, state and federal agents, and academics with a lot of wolf knowledge who will advise on the technical aspects of doing a reintroduction. The biology, the ecology, and a lot of that, whereas a stakeholder advisory group will handle some of the social aspects. In year 2, the plan is to really ramp up a lot of their public outreach campaign. There's been some discussion about whether they would have a draft wolf plan to take to the public or if they'd go to the public first. That still is kind of undecided. I'd certainly mention, I think it makes more sense to have a draft plan that the public responds to, but we'll see. The good thing is that they have been very committed to saying they need to gather a lot of public input. They need to be out there. They need to be answering questions. So that should be encouraging for Coloradans to know that they're going to have an opportunity to weigh in. And the commission has also very specifically said they want to kind of spread this out throughout the state, not just do it in Grand Junction in Denver, but give some good access to people. And so the hope is that by the end of year 2, we have a fairly solid draft of what the plan is going to be. Um, so then once we have that nearly final draft, it's going to take one more kind of public tour. In this case, I imagine it would be posted online and they'd have online comments. Um, and then we're going to have our revised plan, and it's supposed to all kick off by the end of year 3. We're supposed to be reintroducing wolves December 2023. So here's just kind of another way to look at this timeline. That's pretty good. There are some concerns. The main concern that's been raised is if we adopt this 3-year plan, that puts us to releasing wolves in December 2023, which is the deadline that the proposition states. And we really don't want to be working against a deadline because what is not on this timeline are legal challenges and just bureaucratic holes, delays. Things are going to happen that are going to gum up the works a little bit, and we just anticipate it's not likely it's going to be smooth sailing from here to December 2023. That in mind, and with the suggestion that biologists have made that the ideal time to release wolves is between the months of December and February. So that's when normally young wolves would be dispersing, finding mates, starting new families. So that's the biological window. So that in mind, we would really advocate for releases to take place somewhere between December 2022 and February 2023. That doesn't mean that every wolf the agency plans to release needs to be released in that window, but we would argue it should begin by then to make sure that we're in advance of that deadline, that we don't violate it. When this plan was adopted, several commissioners did adopt this plan, but did express concerns that the plan mentions year 1, year 2, year 3. They felt like that really should be even more approximate, not year, but phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, because they didn't want us to be locked, to that 2021, 2022, 2023. More, hey, we'll go to phase 2 when we're ready to go to phase 2. And if that happens to be this year, great. So these are some of the expressed statements from the commission. But of course, we have to wait and see what happens. And that's what, where the really important public role comes in is, for those interested to be following along on this, to be ready to reach out and write to commissioners or other players involved in this, just make sure that our views are expressed and that people know, those of us who did vote yes on Proposition 114, we're still paying attention, we're still following the process, and we want it to be done according to the best available science and in a way that works for all Coloradans. So just a quick little review of our timeline right now. January 14th. Yeah, go ahead.
So you said you expect legal challenges. What kind of legal challenges can be filed given it was a ballot initiative?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd say the biggest one on our radar is really just what's the federal delisting's impact? And if that gets reversed, where's that going to put us? So this is less a legal challenge in the sense of courts, but it does open up a lot of legal questions. So right now, Colorado Parks and Wildlife has the authority to do the reintroduction because as of January 4th, gray wolves are no longer on the endangered species list. We kind of expect that. We certainly hope that will change and that wolves will be relisted again at a federal level. And now that means, okay, now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services is back in charge of the program. So where does that leave CPW? Well, now it gets complicated because now if they're a federally listed species, to do a reintroduction, it has to go through all the channels of the Endangered Species Act, which likely, at least this is how it's been done with every other wolf reintroduction, would involve something called a 10J, a 10J process, which is a non-essential experimental population area. That's how wolves were reintroduced in the northern Rockies and how Mexican wolves were reintroduced in the Southwest. And basically what this is a 10J establishes a boundary where this kind of experimental population can be developed. And it eases up some restrictions. So it allows those animals to be controlled under certain circumstances. So for example, a Mexican gray wolf program, if there's a Mexican gray wolf that's shown to be a chronic depredator, this animal keeps taking cattle, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service could choose to come and lethally remove that wolf. Whereas if it had full endangered species protection, that's not an option. So basically, a 10J gives them some flexibility, and that tends to be the way that they reintroduce some of these species, especially if it goes into an area where people are going to be, as opposed to if it's a really remote area. But on top of that, I fully expect, so Rio Blanco came out and said, no wolves here. And if the state goes ahead and says, too bad, we're going to reintroduce wolves into Rio Blanco County, I could see Rio Blanco filing a court case and saying, you're challenging our rights. And whether or not they have a legitimate case, it's going to take time, to move its way through the court process. So I think there are a lot of things like, and a lot that I'm probably just not even thinking of, that's going to surprise us and just take up some time on all of this. So just looking quickly at our timeline. So again, January 14th is when they adopted that proposal. They closed the request for purchase for the formal facilitator that's going to lead the stakeholder advisory group on March 19th. And then at the end of March, the 31st, that's when they closed applications for the stakeholder advisory group. The technical work group, they were never accepting applications, but they were accepting recommendations, and they were going to just choose on their own. And that's kind of their stated date. They said March 31st, make sure we have all the recommendations by then. We expect May 1st is when that facilitator will start working. And so around that time is when I'm expecting that we'll find out who was appointed to the stakeholder advisory group and technical work group. And probably some of this will get fleshed out at that next commission meeting, May 5th and 6th. So a little bit of a holding pattern right now while we wait to see where everything's going to land. I'm going to try to fly through these because I don't think this detail is super critical, but just a little explanation of what those roles are. The professional facilitator is supposed to be, again, a professional, not a pro-wolf, not an anti-wolf, somebody whose role is there is to make sure conversations are productive, that we're not just taking shots at each other and that we're actually having some meaningful discussion and moving this along. So I think the commission rightly identified that needs to be, a kind of apolitical professional individual. It shouldn't be a CPW staff or anything like that. So hopefully they got some good applications and we're going to get a good facilitator. This is something I mentioned earlier. We've got the potential to do it right, but it depends on the people. And if we unfortunately don't have a good facilitator, that could dictate a lot moving forward. Stakeholder advisory group, this is just from Colorado Parks and Wildlife documents that they release. It's just an idea of some of the sort of people that they're thinking about for the stakeholder advisory group, who might be involved in this. I should mention as well that the assistant director of Colorado Parks and Wildlife stated at the last commission meeting that they sent a letter to the Southern Ute and Mountain Ute tribes asking how they would like to be involved in the process. So that's great, as opposed to saying, we want you to be a stakeholder, saying, do you want to be involved and how? However, they were pressed and asked, well, what about all the indigenous peoples living in Colorado who aren't represented formally by a tribe like the Utes are? So that remains an outstanding question. I think this is something we just need to continue to explore in Colorado and across the West, is how can we better develop relationships with our tribal partners and indigenous persons to make sure that they have a say, that they are included, and it's not an afterthought or a tokenization to just slap somebody on the council and pat yourself on the back. So again, their idea here, the stakeholder advisory group, I will mention, it's an advisory group. They don't actually have any authority to make any rules. They will advise the commission, but of course it's expected that their advice is going to carry a lot of weight. That the commission's really going to listen to that, especially if they happen to come to consensus. Because if you get all these diverse people agreeing, that probably means you're on the right track. Meanwhile, the technical work group, like I mentioned, is going to be looking, where do we release the wolves? Where do those wolf populations come from? What might the environmental impact be? What are target populations? All those kind of technical questions, that's going to be addressed by this technical work group, which is meant to include, you see here, lots of different state and federal agents. This wasn't on the initial list that they put on here, but we pressed a lot and we did get them to say yes. We are also going to be looking at academics, wolf biologists, folks who really know what they're talking about. So this isn't just an agency body, but it also represents the best available science. All right, this is my last one, legislative updates. So we've had a total of 4 bills that were introduced this legislative session that relate to wolves. 3 of them you see right here have all failed to pass committee. 1 of them was good. 2 of them we did not like. So I messed up that first name. House Bill 1037, not 20137, typo, would have made it impossible to release wolves. They were trying to say you can't release wolves into a county that didn't vote yes, and you can't release wolves into a county if there's a species there that the agency has spent money on. Well, that's elk, deer, moose, that's everything. SB 21105, implement and finance gray wolf reintroduction, was another just burdensome, complicated bill that would have created some statutory language for how public input was received. And it would have basically made it impossible to do any kind of wolf reintroduction before the end of 2023. Fortunately, both of those were postponed indefinitely in committee. That's just legalese for saying it's dead. It's not going anywhere. HB 211040, however, initially was not something we were supportive of. Initially, this bill said funds, it made some restrictions on how gray wolf reintroduction would be funding, and particularly it barred the use of sports persons' dollars. So we worked on an amendment on that, got that to a good place, some good hard bipartisan work. However, once it was amended, the body of the language no longer fit the title, so they had to reintroduce it. It has since been reintroduced as House Bill 1243. This is sponsored by Perry Will and Jenny Arndt, so bipartisan sponsors. This ended up passing the House and Energy Committee last week on a 12-0 vote. So now it's on its way into appropriations. From there, hopefully it's going to be on the House floor. Once it passes the House floor, we'll start the whole process over again in the Senate. So it'll go through committee, then appropriations, then the Senate floor, and then we'll hold Congress and hopefully get this to Jared Polis' desk, get a signature on it. What this will do is, yes, it says no money derived from hunting licenses will be used. So that, makes, I think, a lot of the folks on the Western Slope happy. And it also secures general funds for the wolf reintroduction. So this means there is now, in theory, adequate funding secured for wolf reintroductions, while also respecting the wishes, of sports persons who don't want to see, their fees being used for this. So we are pretty pleased about that. It's always good when you find a good compromise like that and are able to work together. It is late in the session at this point, so there is a slim chance another bill could be reintroduced, but we think that's pretty unlikely. This is probably what we're going to see for this session. So, all that long-winded chatter out of the way. That's kind of the updates on where things are right now. So it's definitely keeping an eye on the commission, keeping up to date on their developments. But like I mentioned earlier, I think we're in a pretty good place. The reality is we're reintroducing wolves. It's going to happen. And the commission has made it clear they're not interested in relitigating this. This was the vote. This is what people decided. Like it or not, this is what they're going to do. So that's been really encouraging to hear. We just got to stay vigilant and make sure all along the way, we're doing it the right way.